Hello from Lahinch, County Clare on the wild west coast of Ireland. I'm Rory McKiernan and you're very welcome to the Love and Courage podcast. A big thanks for tuning in. I'm excited to share another great episode with you. My guest is Joe Murray. Joe is the coordinator with Afri, Action from Ireland, which is a small but significant national and independent Irish organisation working for human rights, global justice and environmental action since 1975. Afri's patron is none other than Nobel Peace Prize laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Originally from Ballyglasson, Carrickboy in County Longford in the Irish Midlands, Joe has been with Afri for over 40 years now. Not one for the limelight, he is a highly regarded and I would say humble leader, often quietly working behind the scenes, something that we will be discussing. He has, however, been recognised in the past with an Unsung Hero award from Desmond Tutu and a humanitarian award from the Dalai Lama. I've known Joe a long time, and as you're about to hear, he's often reluctant to speak about himself and the work that he does. So it was a great honour that he finally accepted my invitation to come on the Love and Courage podcast to talk about his own journey, his motivations and his deeper thoughts into the work and why he does it. This podcast is also available as a video version on the Love and Courage YouTube channel and on the Afri YouTube channel, as well as on my Facebook page. Just look up Rory McKiernan Hitching for Hope on Facebook. Before we get started, I want to say a big thanks as well to all who chip in to support the podcast, either on a once-off or on a monthly basis. It helps to reach listeners in over 50 countries and to share important voices like Joe's, voices that I think we need to get out into the world. If you want to chip in, please head over to loveandcourage.org. It takes just a minute, either now or later on. When you get a minute, just take a note, loveandcourage.org. And if you're new to the podcast, please do check out the archive of great conversations and be sure to hit subscribe on your podcast app. Ratings and reviews are also appreciated, as is recommending the podcast to friends and family on social media and elsewhere. Thanks also to everyone who continues to support my book, Hitching for Hope, and for all the support with my wife, Susan Quirk's album launch. Her debut album, Into the Sea, is out about 2 weeks now, and it's been a great success so far with lots of national and regional radio play, press features and reviews in the media. And music fans buying digital and signed CD copies direct from her via her Bandcamp page. It's great that you can listen on Spotify and all of these places, but supporting the musicians these days is so important. And susanquirk.bandcamp.com is a great place to go for that. The support, it really does matter, and I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone who's shared and supported the album in so many different ways. There's been listeners and fans all over the world. So it's Into the Sea by Susan Quirk, and you can find out more about Susan, her music, and her online Learn to Meditate classes over at susanquirk.com. That's Quirk, Quirke. I'll also be ending this podcast with a song from the album, a track called Home, which is about the global refugee crisis. Okay, folks, let's get back to this episode of the Love and Courage podcast. It's time to get started now with the conversation with Joe Murray. I hope you enjoy. Joe Murray, you're very welcome to the Love and Courage podcast. It's taken me a while to get you to agree to this, but the moment has finally arrived.
Yeah, I've been, it's the first I've ever done, probably the last as well, but I'm delighted it's with you, and I don't think not too many people could encourage or persuade me to do something like this, but anyway, yeah. I'm in your hands, Rory.
Yeah, would you mind if I just talked about that momentarily, Joe? My sense is that, one of the reasons that a lot of people admire how you work and what you do is you don't really make it about you. Is that a conscious decision, or how do you feel about all of that?
Well, it is kind of a conscious decision. I really don't like the limelight. I don't like doing this end of the job. But, at the same time, it's necessary at times, and it's good at times to do it as well, and it's important. But I suppose when I came into Afri, or at least when I took over, I suppose, being director of Afri or coordinator of Afri, one of my great reservations was that I wouldn't be somebody who would go out looking for publicity or who wouldn't, be a very front-line person. So I thought that would be a great disadvantage. But strangely, I have found the opposite in a way, in that I think it actually works very well. And what it does is it allows other people's voices to be heard. And I kind of see that as, a role that I have and a role that Afri has, is it kind of amplifies the voice of other people. So in other words, I don't feel I have to be saying it because, really it's about the issues and it's about, people's struggles and people's voices that need to be heard. And if Afri can provide a platform for that to happen, then I'm quite happy, to be in the background or to be, side stage, but not necessarily on stage. Yeah. But again, sometimes it's necessary and sometimes you have to do it and sometimes it's important.
Yeah. It's an often misunderstood type of leadership to be behind rather than in front. And, there seems to be a tendency for the big showman or showwoman up front.
But I was kind of thinking about it this morning, and I don't know, there's a role, I suppose, as a producer, which, in films or theatre, the producer is not often seen, but he or she plays an important role. And I kind of feel that, like when it comes to events that we organise, whether it's Féile Bríde or the Famine Walk or the Hedge School, there are jigsaw pieces to be put together in order for the things to happen. And I like that part of it. I actually love that part of it. And I love working with people, visionary people and people who have, exciting ideas and have, knowledge that I don't have and expertise that I don't have. And together we can create something really interesting. And, and often that is the case, that something really good comes out of those discussions, out of those chats together, putting the thing together and then letting it happen.
Yeah.
And, and it's great when it does happen. It's a great sense of satisfaction. And, I'm very happy that I've been a very small part of it, at least in the final outcome, So anyway, I strangely, what I would have considered to be shortcoming maybe has turned out, from my point of view, to be something positive and good.
Yeah, I think it's something that a lot of people might grapple with, this notion that they're not the right person. I guess classically it's referred to as imposter syndrome, but it's an important thing to overcome and challenge it, isn't it? Yeah,
well, you see, I think there's a very, particular understanding of what leadership is, which is to be out there in front and to be the voice and to be the person and to be, that charismatic person that represents the organization or the issue or whatever. And it's a legitimate style of leadership, and some people do that very well. But I think what's important to realize is that if you don't have that, it doesn't mean that you don't have a role. It doesn't mean that you cannot be a leader. And it just means to find your own way of doing things and allow it to happen. Sometimes allow it to happen around you.
Yeah, I think there was a TED talk out. I can't remember the exact name or person behind it, but it was something along the lines of the power of introverts. I'm not saying you're an introvert per se, but it's the idea that the quiet is so often understated and under-recognized, and the society, for whatever reason, values and champions the loud, brash, charismatic, and assumes that that's more effective. Whereas in matter of fact, often it can be absolutely getting in the way, and particularly getting in the way of collaboration.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Yeah, well, that's very true about getting in the way of collaboration. But also, it's kind of understandable in the media age in which we live, that people want entertainers, they want sound bites, they want big personalities, they want entertainment, really. And I don't see myself as an entertainer. I suppose, like, I'm driven by something, and I'm not driven by the need to entertain. I'm driven by something else. And, if I can be part of facilitating an issue to be raised or a voice to be heard or, action to happen, then that's what gives me my job satisfaction, if you like.
Yeah, well, I think what's coming to mind somewhat is the idea that TV personalities and entertainment entering the world of politics. We had recent examples in the US that can show us where that ends up.
Yeah.
And, give me a quiet, strong, calm person any day in that regard. And speaking of quiet, calm person, there's, for those of you watching the video version of this, there will be an audio version. There's a painting behind you on the wall of a calm, quiet person. And I'd like you to talk about who that person is, Joe, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, one of the great things about the work that I've done is the extraordinary people that I've come across, that I've had the pleasure and the privilege of working with, that I've been inspired by. And, and often, like you were saying, not the obvious people, but the quiet, consistent campaigner or, the one who consistently works for justice, And one such person is Colm Roddy, who's, amazingly, I find it amazing that he's actually, he's on the wall behind me, and he finds it even more amazing. I was talking to him recently, and he had a great laugh at the idea of it, because he probably, without exaggeration, is one of the most humble people I've ever met. He's extraordinarily self-effacing and humble.
So can you tell people who he is and what he's been about and what he does? Yeah, anyone that doesn't know.
He's an extraordinary man. I met him first in Cambridge Manor. I did the development studies in Cambridge in 1979, and I worked there as registrar in 1980. And Colm did the course then. And he tells the story himself, so I'm not speaking out of turn. But when he arrived to do the course, there was a receptionist in Cambridge, and there was a big parlour inside the door. And the receptionist, when Colm came to sign up to do the course, the receptionist brought him into the parlour and put him sitting in there and brought him in a sandwich and a cup of tea because he thought he was homeless, So Colm often tells that story. But so he did the development studies course, and he had been an engineer by profession, but he actually left. He walked out of his job because of the political corruption he saw. The politicians interfering in planning and all that. So he was a man of incredible principle then and continues to be now. Then he went to Ethiopia. He worked there for, I think, 6 years. He's married to Sally Faye from Beatrice Christie. They have 3 children which they adopted in Ethiopia. And then Colm went on to become a peace activist, really, almost full-time. And recently then, I suppose, why his picture is behind me on the wall is because he did an action in Shannon 5 years ago now, and in protest at the use of Shannon by US military. And he and Dave Donham went in, and they did it from a faith perspective. So it was a faith action, a faith action in opposition to war. And they, cut the fence, went in and waited to be arrested and were arrested. And then 4 years later, they were brought to court, and there was an extraordinary court case last year, which I attended, and they put forward an extraordinary defence of their actions, and they were both actually found not guilty, both Dave and Colm. So it's an extraordinary story, and it's a great, it's an inspirational story, really, because as we were talking about earlier, leadership takes many forms, and, Colm is often seen on his own outside the door or outside government buildings, just holding up a placard, reminding us and reminding the world of what war is about, and particularly about Ireland's involvement in it through Shannon Airport. And that's an incredibly important message that we need to get out. And, the importance of what Colm did and the integrity with which he has done it is fantastic,
And I think he's in and around the age of 80. He might be a little bit south of 80.
very close to it, which is fantastic, and he's still, incredibly committed and devoted. And that painting was done by Owen O'Loughlin, which is Corey Pearce's grand-nephew, did this painting of Colm, and my sister-in-law bought it for me. So that's why Colm ends up on my wall behind me.
So Shannon has been a long-standing issue of concern for you, for Afri, and for many people, but it also seems to have gone a bit quiet in recent times in terms of the public visibility, notwithstanding the actions of Dave and Colm and others. But why do you think it's so hard to kind of get traction? Or, consistent polls have said the public does oppose the militarization, the military use of a civilian airport for foreign wars and so on. But yet, it seems to flare up and die down. The Labour Party, the Green Party, others have said they opposed it, but then they get into government, not much happens.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Rory. And it's a very frustrating issue. Like since the beginning, Afri has been involved in one way or another in trying to oppose it, to highlight the obscenity of what's happening. But as you say, we've had little or no progress, which is sad to report. But I really don't understand that it's a thing that should be, a number one priority for people, but it's not. And that includes people who are concerned about many social issues and many justice issues. But I've been talking about this recently with my colleague and Afri board member, John Maguire, as to, I don't know what it is that we have a great difficulty in confronting the issue of militarization and war. And in one way, it's very understandable because it's a very overwhelming issue. It is, along with climate change, it's up there as really the greatest threat to our planet. And the two things are completely interwoven and interlinked, climate change and militarization. And we've managed to take on board the climate change issue. It's actually been addressed. There's a huge awareness now of the urgent need to tackle climate change for all our survivals. And that's a fantastic thing. But there's not the same awareness at all in relation to militarization and war, which holds equal potential to destroy our planet. We have more nuclear weapons than can destroy the planet several times over, and governments are adding to them. We had this shocking announcement recently that the British government is going to spend an initial 78 billion on increasing updating their military hardware. And I was talking to Richard Moore yesterday from Children Crossfire, and they have completely cut the aid budget, the British government, including, the work that Children Crossfire do, this incredible, important work. So it's a clear example of how the war industry is being supported and funded, and peace and development is being neglected and underfunded. But, there's no sense of outrage about that. And I find that extraordinary, that I don't know what it is. We don't seem to be able to take on board or face up to this, this essential threat to our planet and to ourselves. $1,900 billion is spent every year on weapons and preparation for war. $1,900 billion. Imagine what that could do. We did a project in Afri called Just a Second, where we calculated what the arms industry costs every second, and we used the money we raised to fund 26 anti-poverty projects all over the world. That's from 1 second, and that was 15 years ago. It has almost doubled since then. So it's an extraordinary issue. It's one that we have to confront. We're not doing so, and I don't know, we haven't got the language. But I suppose we didn't succeed for a long time with climate change, and then something happened, like Greta Thunberg emerged, and maybe it'll take something like that for us to realise the urgency of the issue of militarisation and war that faces us.
How much of it do you think is education, information and awareness conundrum whereby, you certainly might read about conflicts in the media, or you might read about refugees drowning and so on, but very rarely do you find out about where they're from, what they were fleeing from, and who was bombing them and where the bombs were made.
That's exactly the issue, Rory. And until we begin doing that, I think, Jack Hines, he was a board member of Afri, and he said, you can either, if a tap is leaking, you can either keep on mopping up the water off the floor, or you can fix the tap. And that's what we're not doing in relation to the whole issue of refugees and forced migration. We're not looking to what is driving them. It's climate change and war, and we do recognise the climate change dimension to it, but governments and corporations continue to supply weapons to the most brutal regimes, and they do it without, respect, as if it's a respectable thing to do. Donald Kelly wrote a play called The Business of Blood, and really, that's what war and the weapons industry is. And sadly, Ireland is getting more immersed in that, and again, it's happening by stealth, and there's very little awareness or opposition.
What were some of the early kind of formative experiences or people in your life that led you to get an initial awareness of the world around you, whether that be as a child or as a teen, and then later as into your 20s and so on?
Yeah, well, I came from rural Ireland to County Longford, a very remote part of County Longford, and but my parents my father in particular had a great sense of the world and of, what's going on in the world. He listened to the news avidly. He talked about things that were happening, and my mother would have been less interested, but incredibly compassionate, particularly in later years when we had television, because we didn't have television for much of my youth, but later on, the empathy that she had for suffering people, it was extraordinary. It was as if
take your time, Joe. No problem.
Sorry, geez, I don't know where that came from.
Well, I think underneath so many of these issues are, I suppose that's, I wasn't at the forefront of my mind there, Joe, but at the end of the day, the things that drive us on end up being deeply personal, don't they? And the people that influence.
Exactly, yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, you just think of, I suppose, I began thinking about the struggles that my mother went through and my parents went through. But they still had that generosity of spirit, that they weren't just focused on looking after their own family, but they had an awareness and an outreach to other people, and that kind of compassion, which is incredibly important today. It's not outdated. It should run through everything we do. Because if we get harsh and uncaring, then we're losing something really important.
So, Joe, it seems that apple, didn't fall too far from the tree for yourself, but also for other family members. I would have met your brother Paddy, for instance, and it seems that the values and the influence of your parents really kind of was massive for the whole family.
Yeah, it's actually true, Rory, and it's interesting because, I knew I was doing this today and I was thinking about it. And so my family, all of them, I'm one of 8 in the family, and all of them are involved in somewhere or another in CASA, which is the Caring and Sharing Association, which my brother founded, or in similar types of work, So I suppose what it does show is how much influenced we are by our family situation and by the values that our family holds. And one of the things I was thinking about is we had an aunt who lived across the fields from us, and she was a fantastic character, and we loved to see her coming because she was great entertainment. She was Aunt Mary, but she'd always come with a little parcel under her arm when she'd come to visit us. And she'd open up the parcel and it would be a jumper that she had knitted for one of us, So, she had her family reared, so she looked to help out then with us because we were coming up later on. But like that lovely generosity, again, that generosity of spirit where she did what she could. She didn't have a lot herself, but she knew how to knit. So she came, and we'd all be wondering who would get the jumper this week, or this month. So, so I think there is that kind of, that dimension of kindness and generosity and goodness, really, which is there, and that's something we should retain and treasure and bring into whatever we do in life. We can. It's a very important to have a good political analysis and to be, clear about the causes of injustice. But I really strongly believe that we have to do it with compassion and with a degree of kindness, because there's enough harshness and hardness in the world,
I'm staying with County Longford for a bit. I think I recall you telling me about an epic battle in the area you're from. I don't know if it is something you can talk about on the record, but there was something concerning a pig farm. Is that something that you can talk about?
Oh yeah, I'm quite happy to talk about it, really. Some people think I never stop talking about it. Pat Pigeon used to call me Slurry Murray at one stage, so I'm happy to do that.
Oh God.
I don't want that name to stick. Yeah, like I grew up on a small farm. It was like, amazingly, it's what we're trying to recreate. It was a sustainable farm. We grew our own vegetables. We had a few cows, we had sheep, and we had goats, and we had a litter of pigs as well, a sow which produced a litter. So I don't have any animosity towards pigs per se. But then, some years ago, a neighbour sold his land, and it was bought by this man, and he built a gigantic piggery, which now has 34,000 pigs in it. And I really think that's obscene, in the sense that, just they never see the light of day. They're born, they're fed, they're injected, whatever, and then they're sold. And, so there's that. And then there is the environmental consequences of it, like piggery smell. And, as far as I'm concerned, it has contaminated the place of my birth, which is, it's a great regret. My family still live there. My sister lives there. We visit her. Well, we used to visit her regularly when we could, and we will again. But yeah, it's terrible that you have to now breathe in the foul air of the piggery when you go to your home place.
It really does speak to the damage of industrial agriculture. I'm not suggesting that we're going back to sort of small peasant-like farming, although that certainly has its merits, as on Talamh Bio and others would advocate, and organic farming and permaculture and so on. But I mean, when you get to that level, 34,000 animals that, as you said, never see the light of day, and there's health, environment, and all sorts of issues there.
Yeah, I just think that it's wrong, and I think future generations will look back and say, how do we let things like that happen? But at the moment there is a demand, and demand is being met, and but hopefully, and I think it is obviously there is an increase in awareness about climate change and the impact of it, and one of the issues is intensive farming. Like, it's a huge contributory factor, so that has to be addressed. And I would hope a more humane kind of farming system emerged,
Your thoughts around this, Joe, have they influenced your own kind of consumption choices and diet and so on? And are you vegetarian?
Yeah, we are vegetarian. Now, again, I'm vegetarian for about, I don't know, maybe 15 years, something like that. So it took me a long time. But all except one in our family is vegetarian. So yeah, and I do think that's important. For environmental reasons and for animal welfare or care for animals, I now would find it difficult to think about eating meat, whereas one time, for most of my life, it was a completely natural thing. And again, when I grew up at home, you weren't in a position to choose or to be fussy or to say I want to eat meat, because if you didn't, there wouldn't be that much else.
I want you to take me to when you were at that kind of late teens and early 20s. What did you choose college, or what path did you take, and where did you end up?
Yeah, well, I went to St. Mel's College in Longford, and I was happy enough there. And then after that, I joined Kiltegan, St. Patrick's in Kiltegan Missionary Society. I suppose I always had this concern, this desire to, work in relation to the global south. I didn't know how. At that time, the main channel was as a missionary, So I left St. Mel's and went to Kiltegan, and I was there for 6 years, and there were 6 extremely happy years. People now might think that was a terrible thing to do, but I don't think that at all. I had 6 extraordinary years where I met amazing people, many of whom are still great friends of mine, So, and it was a very formative experience. I learned to meditate, which is something I do to this day, and it's something really positive that I would want to share with anyone that would be interested. So I spent 6 years there, and then I left, and I did the development studies course, as I mentioned, where I met Colin Roddy, and that introduced me to the area that I'm involved in now. I got to again meet incredible people, and a man called Michel de Vertaille was a very influential teacher, and he talked about like the obvious thing now, it seems, but at the time for me it's mind-blowing that hunger is man-made and man-maintained, and it can be changed by people if the political will exists. Man is a sexist term, but it's appropriate, I think, in this context. And so my mind was really opened up. I met people from all over the world there, and it was just a fantastic place to be. Yeah.
And ultimately, you chose not to become a missionary as such, Joe. So, what was involved in that choice? And then, obviously, you could argue that you took the same impulse and moved it into different directions.
Yeah, well, I was 6 years, and it was a 7-year course, so I was at a point of decision making, and and I was quite open to the idea at the time, but what I felt was I had, grown up in rural Ireland. I had gone to college, and then I had gone straight into a seminary, and I was now going to make a lifelong commitment without having had any real experience of life. So that was the main thing. I said I was leaving for that reason. And and then when I came out, I got involved in working with homeless people in Sherrard House. Actually, a great friend of mine then was Tony Ryan, still a good friend of mine, and we worked in Sherrard House, and we set up a house then for homeless people, and so that was for me that was incredible, coming out of a seminary, and I was really now in a whole other world. But it was extraordinarily mind-blowing, really, to see what was happening, the condition of people in homelessness, and and then to meet people who are doing some great work on that area. So I got completely involved in that, and then I met Mary Lou as well, so that had a part to play.
I'd say it had a large part to play.
It had a large part, but we met, and and we broke up for 7 years, because you need to think about things before you rush into them, and
yeah.
Anyway, it seemed to be meant to be because and it's been one of the great experiences of my life, meeting and marrying Mary Lou eventually and having 4 children that we have now.
Yeah, wonderful. I think during those 7 years, I think you had an initial, from my own memory of talking to you before, did you spend time, you spent a year or two abroad during that time, did you?
Yeah, you have a good memory, Rory. Yeah, well, one of the things I did then was I went to Brazil, and at the time I was very influenced by liberation theology, and that man Michel de Vertaille that I mentioned, he was a great liberation theologian, and it was really exciting what was happening in terms of liberation theology, particularly in Latin America. So I went out to the Kiltigans in Recife in northern Brazil. There was a man there, I don't know if anyone will have heard of him, Helder Câmara was his name. He was a very radical bishop. He's famous for saying, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask, why do the poor not have food, they call me a communist, So we're in Recife where he was. In fact, I met him, and he was a very inspirational figure. And stayed with the Kiltegan guys there. And it's just fantastic what was happening. The real sense of, really people struggling for justice and, working in the favelas. And it was a very, very enriching and challenging and amazing place to spend time, So I suppose that certainly reinforced my decision as to work. This is the area I want to work in. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew this is what I wanted to do. And I was just very lucky then the doors opened where I ended up in Afri and worked overseas with Concern in Sudan. And, so circumstances and people lead you in directions. And
Do you think, you've referred to it as being lucky, but do you think there are also choices, like the path obviously can move this way and that way, but at the end of the day, you signed up for a path, or whether it be a vocation, it wasn't just a pure accident you ended up in those places.
Yeah, well, that's true. I was always looking for a way to, work. As I said, initially I thought the missionary way was the way, but then when that wasn't to be, I wanted to find a way that you could do that kind of work as a ordinary citizen, So yeah, I was always looking for that, and I was always, I was very inspired by Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day, and later on Desmond Tutu, and so I suppose, yeah, as you say, I was making decisions, and I was looking for a path and kind of following that path as I was looking. But yeah, I was searching and making decisions, but also very lucky that ways opened up.
Did livelihood ever come into your mind, or did you think about it much in terms of careers and salaries and houses and starting a family? Because that would be at the front of a lot of people's mind when they choose what direction they go.
Exactly. Well, that's a very interesting question, because we were talking about that the other day with my son here, who's 25, and I was saying, well, he was saying he'll probably never buy a house, and I was saying, well, when I was 25, I never thought I would buy a house either. Although it was much more achievable, but not for me. And like you said, I had no intention. I had no thoughts about buying a house. Never. I didn't even think about being a father. I just thought, I had an idea about the work I wanted to do and the ways I wanted to do it, and that's really I was completely preoccupied with that. I'm not necessarily saying it was a good thing, but that's the way I was. I suppose I was lucky in the sense that Mary Lou is a bit more practical, and she kind of thought it was a good idea we'd live in a house if we were together. So Mary Lou is a good balance
Yeah, do you think that speaks to the idea that, if you choose the core decision from the right place and commit to it, that, obviously environment and circumstances vary massively and have can add a lot to the way, as in the housing market is the housing market. If it's bad, it's bad. But on another level, things have a way of working out as well.
Yeah, well, certainly that's true for me, and it's true for a lot of people. But then I suppose, yeah, as you say, not everybody. I had a lot of advantages, really. I had, very secure upbringing, and I had an education, and I had contacts, and so I kind of had a good network around me, including, I have great siblings who are very supportive. Have always been and continue to be. So yeah, so I had a very good. I had security around me, even though I didn't have much at the time, and I wasn't interested. Like, I don't know, we worked for very small salaries for many years in Afri, and that it wasn't a consideration because we could live. But so to a certain extent, things will work out, but they'll work out better for some than others, because some have an advantage already,
Yeah, well put. Yeah. Where at the moment do you see signs of hope and inspiration? Is there anybody or anything or any campaign or movement that is lighting you up at the moment?
Yeah, well, I'm incredibly encouraged by Greta Thunberg and the whole youth movement, climate change movement. I find that fantastic. I'm really hopeful, and the great awakening around climate change is a very hopeful thing. I believe. We've been working in schools since I started in Afri, and we've gone into an awful lot of schools and spoken to an awful lot of people. But sometimes you'd say, is it having any impact at all? And I'm not saying it is that's had the impact, but something has had an impact. And it's probably, those pebbles in the water all over the years that helped at least to bring about this great awakening that has happened now. So I find that very hopeful. People, again, campaigns I've met over the years, like Tom Hyland and his team has been fantastic, really inspirational. The Dunstore Strikers, the work that Richard Moore is doing. So there's wonderful, inspirational people and campaigns and work going on.
Could you give listeners and viewers just a quick snapshot of Tom Hyland's story and also the Dunstore's story?
Yeah, well, I suppose Dunstore's first was... obviously, they took part in an anti-apartheid strike in Henry Street in Dublin, Dunstores. And again, that's a phenomenon that 10 young people walked out of work because they refused to handle what they called the fruits of apartheid, literally fruit that came from South Africa during the apartheid regime. And, Afri had the great pleasure of accompanying them on part of their journey and standing with them on the picket line. We had the connection with Desmond Tutu, and he invited them to South Africa. So we had a part to play, of course, a small part to play, because it was all about the strikers. But again, just to think that they did that. We talked earlier about the spirit of generosity and kindness, and that's part of it. That they gave up their jobs, literally. Like, it's amazing. One of them lost her home because she was on strike, and it's just fantastic. And
they were recognised then by the ANC and South African leadership and the anti-apartheid movement.
And Nelson Mandela met them when he came to Ireland, and he said they were part of the history of South Africa's struggle for freedom, which is fantastic, and rightly so. They were amazing. And then Tom Hyland is another, extraordinary story. He was a bus driver, and he heard or saw a TV program about East Timor, and he gave up his job. He borrowed a typewriter, and he started a campaign in his front room in Ballyfermot. And it certainly was one of the most amazing campaigns that I ever was involved with. And I was a very good friend of Tom. Still am. He's living in Dili now. But it was just such an amazing thing to see how he operated. And he was utterly dedicated. He just gave his life to it. But he also had a fantastic sense of humour. So, the combination of those two, he was incredibly popular with every politician in Dáil Éireann, because he led them all to believe that he was voting for them. Probably would like to say that, but anyway, he's just able to get on with everyone and bring everybody with him for the cause. And he had this absolute 100% commitment to Timor. And, in 1999, Timor achieved its independence. And he, he went there as the honorary consul, and now he's living there. And but again, it's just one of those amazing stories that when I haven't been in schools in a long time, but when I do go to schools, the two stories I tell young people is about the Dunstor strikers. Somebody sitting on a cash register in Dunstores, would they be the first to say, I can do something about apartheid? But they did. And Tom Hyland, bus driver who just saw a programme, and I have no doubt that the campaign in Ireland made a massive contribution to the whole struggle in Timor.
The places like Palestine are coming to mind now when we think, what can we do? And there's always something, isn't there?
There's always something, and and there are great people working on Palestine, and the issue is kept alive. It's a horrific situation there, and it would be fantastic if you could get an outcome. But I think what you have to do is keep on believing, because I used to meet Tom Hyland, and he would have, I'd meet him for coffee in the morning, and he would have been reading about the atrocities that happened in Timor the night before, and he'd tell you all about them. And I used to think, why is he doing this to himself? Why is he killing himself when he'll never succeed? Or, but I never thought I'd see the end of apartheid. I never thought I'd see, the fall of the Berlin Wall. I never thought I'd see peace in Northern Ireland to the extent that it is there now. So, political shifts happen when we don't expect them. We keep on trotting, and nothing seems to happen forever and ever, and then there's a chink and it falls apart. There's a great, people might know of Bruce Kent. He's a great guy, and I have a great time for him. But he has founded a thing called the Movement for the Abolition of War. And I just think that's fantastic. That's the kind of thinking we need. And people say that's ridiculous and it's idealistic, but somebody started a group called the Movement for the Abolition of Slavery. And they were told, that's ridiculous. The economy can't survive without slaves. People need to envision things. People need to think.
What was it like being in South Africa? You were invited to Nelson Mandela's inauguration. What was that moment like?
Oh, it's fantastic. It's fantastic, yeah. Yeah, it's just to be among the crowd when the inauguration happened. And, it really was a moment in history. It was extraordinary, and that it had happened relatively peacefully. Obviously, an awful lot of people, too many people died in the struggle, but the transition had happened relatively peacefully. And here was this inspirational man taking on the baton of power. And there was a moment, I don't like military symbolism, but there was a moment when he was inaugurated, and then I don't know, maybe 6 helicopters flew over with the new South African flag coming down, flying in the wind. And it was just, breathtaking. And afterwards, we ended up back in Soweto. We just got talking to people. And they invited us back to Soweto, and like people were just dancing in the street. It was like carnival, and like it's just. I suppose it never got better in South Africa than that day. Unfortunately, things are not great there now, but still, that was the moment, and they had achieved their goal, and it was just delirium, you know.
So I'm going to move you from South Africa to Kildare now, and one of the great kind of milestones in the annual Afri calendar is the Ballyglasson event. Could you tell people what that's about, how it came about, and why it matters today?
Yeah, well, like I suppose one of the things that distinguishes Afri is that we try to make connections with Irish history and Irish culture, and therefore we have the famine walk, you know, linking back to our experience of An Gorta Mór. And, you know, the fact that it continues today. We do a hedge school. Again, the hedge school arose when people were denied education. They created their own form of education, the hedge school on Scoil Cush Clee, which is a lovely idea. But then Ballyglasson is the festival of Bridget. And Bridget is pretty exceptional. You know, whether it's Bridget the goddess or Bridget the saint, it's... you know, or the symbolism of Bridget is powerful as a woman, as a woman with power at that time. And then there's this story told about the fact that a poor person came looking for food and she gave away her father's most treasured possession, his sword. You know, and the importance of that symbol, like, really, is there any more important symbol today that we need to do than to give away the weaponry and the cost of war and you know, provide for the needs of people. So there's a rich symbolism, and in 1982 or 83, Sean McBride launched what we call the St. Bridget's Peace Cross campaign in Derry, and that was just young people making the old traditional Bridget cross, but we called it a Peace Cross. And we, you know, built a campaign around it of disarmament, really. So when we had done that for 10 years, we decided to have a conference in Kildare. And it just happened to be at the same time the Brigidines were returning to Kildare. So we meant it to be a once-off event, but it has continued up to now. And like, it's a festival, and it's, you know, it's about care for the planet. It's about anti-war. It's about the rights of migrants, but it's about asylum seekers, people in direct provision. You know, so I think, you know, we can take on these issues, and we really need to take them on. But when we can connect them in some way into our own history and culture, they resonate with people more. And, you know, and I think that's an important part of that event. You know, and always we would have music and poetry in everything we do. And I think that's incredibly important. You know, going back to what we talked about earlier, is that we can just be very harsh. And we tended to do this in the beginning, that everything was just berating, you know, a litany of disasters, as somebody characterized it. I think you can't just, you know, inflict the litany of disasters on people. You need to give information. You need to empower people. Well, I think music and poetry plays a very important part, very important function in the whole work of justice. You know, who was it that said, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution." I can't dance, but I could try. But yeah. So, but I think we just need that element, that. Cultural, social, you know, recognizing that we're human beings with many dimensions, not just minds and brains.
Thinking about Kildare there, I'm just thinking about, I'll never forget the image of the Dalai Lama going to Kildare, that obviously yourselves in Afri and Children in Crossfire were made happen. And
yourself in Spunna.
Well, that's there was a variety in the mix there, but you know, not least Richard Moore as well. But the the Dalai Lama arriving into this essentially small town in rural Ireland, and the image of him meeting school kids and then presenting him with a Bridget's cross. And then the next day, that becoming a front page of the Irish Times. Very big, powerful. So what I really saw was this ancient Irish symbol and a Tibetan refugee, essentially, from this other ancient society. And there it was, there was such a magic in that. But two of the kind of key people in that were like Sister Mary and Rita Minahan, the Brigidines. They're what you might say as well, other quiet forces in the background that many people don't always hear about, but when they meet them, they know about it. Could you talk a little bit about those, if you don't mind? And they'll probably cringe to hear themselves talked about, but look at, sometimes you need to name it.
Yeah. Oh no, I agree with you completely, Rory. It's interesting actually. Tomorrow I'm speaking at it's a pre-chapter meeting that the Brigidines have their chapter, and they've asked me to speak on the theme of how can we be good ancestors, which I think is a beautiful idea, and and yeah, like you say, we kind of have had a partnership with the Brigidines for many years around Féile Bríde and the Bridget Cross, and what they're doing in Féile Bríde and elsewhere, like in the Tala Interculture Centre, is incredibly important. And it's kind of reclaiming Celtic spirituality, that wasn't autocratic or what's the word I'm looking for, hierarchical, so like it's a new, an old, a rediscovered kind of form of spirituality that's dealing with care for the planet and how we relate to the earth and how we relate to other people. So I think it's an incredibly important role and an incredibly necessary role. And again, I think it is that thing about the importance of not just, action for change, but action informed by compassion and kindness. Mm. And that's what I find in Kildare, and that's what has kept on bringing me back to it. Mm. And it's personified in the people like, Rita and Mary and Eileen and Phil and, many of the great people that are there,
Mm. And so as we speak now, we're approaching the annual Afri Famine Walk event, which is another kind of key milestone in the calendar. And then this year, obviously, it will be online again because of COVID restrictions. But, we had an amazing experience last year where several hundred people in, I think, over a dozen countries tuned in. But like the Irish famine on Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, it still holds great importance in marking it, doesn't it? And drawing the parallels and therefore that being the point of this annual event.
Yeah, exactly. And, I remember when we started commemorating it, we got really critical articles in a number of newspapers saying, what are these people doing? It's time to forget about that. We're the new Ireland, it's time to move on. But I couldn't disagree more with that perspective. I really think we have to learn from our history and bring the important elements of it forward. Now, obviously, history can be interpreted in many ways, but, and that's why in particular we want to interpret on Gorta Mór, well, in terms of the impact it had on our own people, the suffering that they had, but the fact that we can learn extremely important lessons for today, So, we're the survivors of on Gorta Mór. We've come from there, so it is deeply ingrained in our psyche, and it informs who we are. There's so many important lessons. Obviously the impact of colonialism being under the control of a foreign power and this blind allegiance to laissez-faire economics, they're still so relevant today. But the other one that's really relevant, and I always mention it, is, well, really it's from Carrickboy Walsh, who said it first to me, was the fact that it was an environmental disaster. It was a loss of biodiversity that we had come to depend on one variety of potatoes, the lumper, when there are 2,000 varieties at least. And that's such a salutary lesson in the world in which we live, in which we're heading towards monoculturalism again, when we're handing over control of our food to large corporations, when we're losing the ability to grow food ourselves. It's such a basic thing. We did it when I grew up. It was just a natural thing. You grew enough food for yourself and your family, and even, sell some. So that's something we need to rediscover. And that's another lesson we can take from An Mór. So, so it's an annual event that's coming up again on Saturday the 15th. It is, as you say, online. It was online last year. I found it absolutely fascinating last year. I was kind of dreading it in advance, but it was amazing to see people, and what it meant to people. People who had done the walk over the 33 years or whatever number of years it's been going on, and who really connected with it, and for whom it meant something really significant. And so this year I'm really looking forward to it. And we have an amazingly interesting lineup of people, and you're the host, Rory, so we can't go wrong.
Hope not.
No pressure.
Yeah. And obviously I'm just thinking back some of can you name some of the people that led the famine walk in previous years? Because there was, I think, Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
Yeah, the first ever was Niall O'Brien. Now, I don't know if people will ever remember him. He was in prison in the Philippines. He was a Colombian missionary as well, and he was put in prison on trumped-up charges. And he was in prison for a year. We did a big campaign. His mother was fantastic. She went into a mock prison cell outside the US Embassy, and it became an image that went around the world. In fact, when he was released, the judge held up the picture of his mother inside this cage and saying, "Your mother must be a very powerful woman." Wow. And Katrina Rowan actually led the walk that year. That was the very first year ever. Donegal Dooling. But over the years, we've had, as you mentioned, Desmond Tutu, Tom Highland, and the students from East Timor. Christy Moore, Ronnie Drew, David Dempsey.
The Catholic worker, the Pit Stop Ploughshares. Did they lead it one year?
Kathy Kelly did.
Kathy did, yeah.
Yeah, she's from that tradition as well. So, got the name of the woman who, that famous iconic photograph from Vietnam.
Yeah.
Her
name doesn't come to me.
Yeah, I should remember that now, but it'll come back to me. But it's I think it's an amazing event as well. Obviously, I have a very strong emotional attachment to it, but it just brings so many elements together: history and An Mór, and that incredible location, the Dulac Valley. I don't know if there's a place like it anywhere. It's amazing. And then
it's the memory is very much alive there, isn't it? And to draw those parallels.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it Kim Phuc?
Kim Phuc, exactly. Kim Phuc, yeah. Yeah, and I remember we had people from the Maya, and it was extraordinary. They spoke and their voices echoed back off the mountain. We used to have it on the side of the road. That was before we went to Delphi Lodge, which is a whole other dimension now. But their voices were echoing back. And when they got off the stage where they were speaking, they kissed the ground, and they said, "When we walk, we are walking with the spirit of your ancestors," So it's just amazing moments. And it's a very special place there, and it's been amazing now to make the link with Delphi Lodge, which is the place where the people were turned away from. But now Michael Wade is there, and I think it's a fantastic example of how we can reinterpret history and how we can change things. And he has welcomed the walkers. He has created a memorial to the famine victim, the people who died on that walk, and to all victims of famine. And he is creating an oak grove there in memory. And, so just really reinterpreting and changing what was a really dark memory and experience in history.
Yeah, it's certainly, and I think nothing can, obviously we'll have a great gathering online, but I think nothing can take away from that experience of walking alongside hundreds of other people with the intentionality that comes with it.
Exactly. And the conversations that take place, really, like you could be talking to somebody and then you step aside to let somebody pass, and then you're talking to somebody else. And, like, I think it's a very powerful form of politics, the politics of walking, talking.
Yeah, absolutely.
And music, of course.
So, Joe, one of the things that also comes to mind before we finish up is the fact that Afri remains relatively small organisation, very modest budgets, very nimble. And, Ireland has a massive charity sector, a massive NGO sector. And without getting too critical, I feel that sometimes, or rather too often, the spirit of the original intention of the founders and of the work gets diluted. Perhaps it's just an inevitable part of what we might call success, that the work gets mainstreamed and it settles in and it does what it does and it does it well. But when it comes to challenging orthodoxy or what might be injustice and systemic wrongs, we kind of need to uphold a fighting spirit. And when you get into non-profit worlds and civil society and charity and fundraising, suddenly you can find yourself silenced or silencing yourself. That's been a continual kind of current for Afri, hasn't it?
It has, surely, Rory, yeah. And I understand exactly what you're saying. And I remember, I don't know what year it was now, but it's a fairly long time ago. And Tom Kitt was the Minister for Overseas Development. And he invited everybody from the sector into Ivy House. And there was a big meal and there was waiters with things on their arms and bottles of wine. And I remember thinking, this is a double-edged sword. And I think it really was a moment when the sector was fairly tamed, It was a moment when we moved from being outside the gates to being inside. And I think a lot of the edge was lost at that point, or round about then anyway. It's hard to keep the edge, and you do get tired, and I suppose we all, to some extent, compromise and become silent. But I think, there's certain moments when you are reawakened and like, for example, we were involved in the Rossport struggle, which is, for me, one of the greatest things, that Afri has been involved in. I talked about the non-store strikers in Tom Island. Well, the community in Rossport are on the same level.
Can you talk about why, Joe, just particularly for anyone that maybe isn't that familiar?
Yeah, well, Rossport is a beautiful seaside area in County Mayo, very remote as well. And Shell just came in and discovered gas and said they were building a pipeline right through the heart of the community. And the community said no and resisted unbelievably courageously, and put their lives on the line, and literally were beaten up and, like the way the Irish state operated against the people of Rossport is a scandal and remains a scandal. I hope someday it'll be unveiled. Every agent of state was used against them. And like, these are unbelievably good, solid people. Like, what I always thought is they were like, this is a rural area like where I came from. And I used to see people like my dad or my uncle being beaten up. And it just shouldn't have happened. It did happen. People got away with it. But again, history has a way of unfolding, and you never know yet what will, hopefully, the real story will come out. But they resisted heroically for 12 years, 14 years, but eventually Shell prevailed and they built the terminal and it's now operating. And we got into a lot of trouble with our funding at that stage because we unapologetically took the side of the community. But it was a privilege as well, like when you meet people like Willie Carduff and Vincent McGrath and Mary Carduff and the Shines, you just know. So, and it's important, I think, it's in a way it's the test. And I'm not saying, I think we all fail it in ways, but how do we bring it all back home, It's easy to talk about injustice in the global south, and it's important to talk about injustice. But how do we make that connection back home, whether it's with travellers' rights or people in direct provision, I think that's the test. And I think we have to have the courage of our convictions. And when you see an injustice like direct provision, regardless of the consequences for funding or whatever, you have to speak out,
Hear, hear. Long may it continue, Joe. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and appreciate you sharing some stories and insights from the road. Long may the road continue, and we could do another many hours from the archives here, but we both have to go and prepare for the Famine Walk this year, and looking forward to that. And on behalf of everybody that's, I suppose, watched on the work that you do and Afri does and championed it and supported it, just want to say thank you, Joe, for keeping the flame lit and the flag flying, and onwards.
Thanks a million, Rory. And it's a real pleasure to talk to yourself. As I said at the beginning, this is not something I do easily or lightly, but I just feel comfortable in chatting to yourself, and it really was a chat and a conversation. So thank you for that.
Gora Mahagat.
Slán.
Hello, Rory here again. We have a song coming up in just a moment, so please stay tuned just another while longer. Thanks again for tuning in to the Love and Courage podcast. Thanks to Joe for a great conversation. Can I ask that you might consider sharing this podcast with some friends who might enjoy it, perhaps through social media, WhatsApp, email, or whatever way you find might work. Also, all subscribe, shares, ratings, reviews, all of those things, all appreciated. The same with chipping in as a once-off or monthly patron. And a huge thanks to all who already do. Just head over to loveandcourage.org and check out and support Afri's work at afri.ie, afri.ie. You can find out more about my book, Hitching for Hope, at hitchingforhope.com, and you can find out more about Susan Quirke's music and meditation at susanquirke.com, Quirke. SusanQuirke.com. We'll also be ending now with a song from Susan Quirke's album, Into the Sea. It's called Home, and it was written about the global refugee crisis as a callback to our shared humanity. There's also a powerful video to accompany this song. I hope you enjoy it, and thanks again for your support for the podcast and all my work. Until next time, let's get started with this song from Susan Quirke. It's called Home.